The summer heat in the small town of Greenwood, Mississippi, had a way of clinging to everything. The trees stood tall, casting long shadows over the dusty roads, and the cicadas hummed endlessly in the background. It was a town where everyone knew each other's business, where gossip traveled faster than the wind, and in the heart of Greenwood, nestled among the oak trees and red clay, stood the Johnson family home, a symbol of respect and strength in the African American community. Malcolm Johnson was the eldest child, a star athlete at Greenwood High School. At 19, he was tall, lean, and charismatic, with a future as bright as the summer sun. He had already received a scholarship to play basketball at a prestigious college in the fall, and the whole town was proud of him. His mother, Karen, often said he was destined for greatness. His father, Marcus, a hard-working mechanic, had sacrificed years of his life to ensure his children had opportunities he never did. The Johnson family was well respected, known for their unity and values. Then there was Alicia Johnson, Malcolm's younger sister, just 17 years old. Where Malcolm was athletic and outgoing, Alicia was quiet and introspective. She spent most of her time with her nose buried in books or painting in the little studio she had set up in their attic. Her art was a reflection of her soul, deep and layered, often abstract and full of emotion. Alicia's teachers always remarked on her talent, saying she had the potential to become something great, just like her brother. But beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect family lay a secret, a dark, unspoken bond that was growing stronger with each passing day. It had started innocently enough. Malcolm had always been protective of his sister. As children, they had been inseparable, playing games in the yard, climbing trees, and exploring the woods behind their house. They had shared everything, secrets, dreams, fears. But as they grew older, something began to shift. Malcolm began to see Alicia not just as his little sister, but as something more. His protective instincts morphed into something darker, something he couldn't fully understand. Alicia, too, had noticed the change in their relationship. She could feel it in the way Malcolm's eyes lingered on her for just a moment too long, in the way he stood just a little too close when they were alone. At first, she dismissed it as nothing more than sibling closeness. But soon, the tension between them became undeniable. It was one late summer evening, not long after Alicia's 17th birthday, when things truly began to unravel. The two of them were sitting on the porch swing, the air thick with humidity. Karen and Marcus were inside, watching TV, oblivious to the world outside. Malcolm and Alicia sat in silence, listening to the sound of the crickets and the distant rumble of a passing train. "I can't believe you're leaving for college soon," Alicia said, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft, almost wistful. "It feels like everything's changing so fast." Malcolm glanced at her, his dark eyes reflecting the moonlight. "I know," he replied quietly, "but I'll be back to visit. It's not like I'm disappearing forever." Alicia smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "It won't be the same, though. You've always been here, with me." There was a long pause, and then Malcolm did something he hadn't done in years. He reached out and took her hand, his grip firm but gentle. Alicia looked down at their intertwined fingers, her heart racing. It was such a simple gesture, but it sent a shockwave through her body. She didn't pull away. For the first time, Malcolm allowed himself to voice the thoughts that had been haunting him for months. "Alicia, I don't know how to explain this, but I don't want to leave. Not without you." Her breath hitched, and she pulled her hand away, standing up abruptly. "Malcolm, stop," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You can't say things like that." But Malcolm didn't stop. He stood up too, his tall frame towering over her. "I know it's wrong, Alicia. I know," he said, his voice low and urgent. "But I can't help how I feel. I've tried to ignore it, but it's eating me alive." Alicia took a step back, shaking her head. "This isn't right. We're family. We can't—" "I don't care," Malcolm interrupted, his eyes burning with a desperate intensity. "I don't care anymore. You're the only one I've ever felt this way about, and I know you feel it too." Alicia's heart pounded in her chest. She did feel it, the strange, forbidden connection between them, but she was too scared to admit it, even to herself. Her mind was screaming at her to run, to get as far away from Malcolm as possible, but her feet remained rooted to the ground. In that moment, the world seemed to stand still. The crickets had stopped chirping, and the distant train had long since passed. All that remained was the silence between them, a silence filled with longing, confusion, and fear. Alicia took a deep breath, forcing herself to speak. "We can't do this, Malcolm," she said softly. "It's not right. What would Mom and Dad say? What would people think?" Malcolm's face hardened, and for a moment, she saw a flash of anger in his eyes. "I don't care what they think," he said coldly. "I only care about you." Without another word, Malcolm turned and walked back into the house, leaving Alicia standing alone on the porch, trembling. She watched him disappear inside, her mind racing with conflicting emotions. She knew they had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and as much as she wanted to, she couldn't pretend that nothing had happened. That night, Alicia couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned in her bed, her thoughts consumed by Malcolm's words. She felt trapped by her feelings, trapped by the expectations of her family and her community, and trapped by the knowledge that no matter what she did, things would never be the same. And in the days that followed, the tension between them only grew. Malcolm became more distant, more brooding, and Alicia found herself avoiding him whenever possible. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape the pull of their forbidden bond. It was like a dark cloud hanging over them, suffocating and relentless. As the weeks passed, Alicia began to withdraw from her friends, from her art, from everything that had once brought her joy. She spent hours locked in her room, painting images of broken chains and shattered glass, trying to make sense of the chaos in her heart. But no matter how hard she tried, the storm between them continued to brew, growing darker and more dangerous with each passing day. The days in Greenwood grew longer and hotter as the summer pressed on. The Johnson family carried on with their routines, Karen still attending Sunday service with the local choir, Marcus working tirelessly in his garage, and Malcolm getting ready for college. On the surface, nothing had changed, but beneath that veneer of normalcy, something dark and twisted was festering between the siblings. Alicia could feel the weight of their secret pressing down on her like a physical burden. It was suffocating. Every time she looked at Malcolm, she saw the same intensity in his eyes, the same unspoken feelings that neither of them could ignore. But what frightened her most was the change in Malcolm's behavior. He had always been protective of her, perhaps overly so, but now his protectiveness had morphed into something more dangerous. He became possessive, watching her too closely, questioning her every move. Alicia couldn't breathe without feeling his eyes on her, following her through the house, across the street, even at school. It was as if she was no longer just his sister, but something he needed to control, to keep for himself. At school, Alicia tried to act like everything was normal, but her friends could sense something was off. She no longer laughed as easily, no longer joined them for after-school activities. Instead, she spent her time alone, lost in her thoughts, or scribbling in her journal, the only place where she could be honest about what was happening. In her journal, she wrote about her confusion, her fear, and her guilt. The words flowed out of her like a confession. "I don't know how we got here," she wrote one night. "I never wanted this, but it feels like we can't stop. Malcolm, he's changed. I don't know what to do. I'm scared. I'm scared of him, and I'm scared of what this will do to our family." She hid the journal under her bed, terrified that someone might find it. The thought of her parents discovering the truth made her stomach turn. What would they say? What would they do? Would they hate her? Would they hate Malcolm? She couldn't bear the thought of destroying her family, yet she knew that their secret was a ticking time bomb. Meanwhile, Malcolm's behavior grew more erratic. He stopped hanging out with his friends, stopped talking about his college plans. Even his girlfriend, Tanya, noticed the change in him. Tanya had been dating Malcolm for nearly 2 years, and their relationship had always been solid. But now, Malcolm barely spoke to her. When they were together, his mind seemed somewhere else, somewhere dark and unreachable. "Is everything okay, Malcolm?" Tanya asked him one afternoon as they sat in her car, parked in front of the Johnsons' house. "You've been acting different lately, distant." Malcolm stared out the window, avoiding her gaze. "I'm fine," he muttered. "Just got a lot on my mind." Tanya sighed, reaching out to touch his arm. "You can talk to me, you know. I'm here for you." For a moment, Malcolm almost told her. He almost spilled the whole truth. The truth about the feelings he had for his sister, the secret moments they had shared. But then he stopped himself. He couldn't say it. How could he ever explain something like that? "I'm fine, Tanya," he repeated, this time more forcefully. "Just drop it." Tanya frowned, but didn't push the issue. She had always known Malcolm could be moody, but this was different. Something was really wrong, and she didn't know how to help him. Back at home, Alicia couldn't escape Malcolm's presence. He was always there, always watching. At night, she locked her bedroom door, afraid he might come in. She no longer trusted him, not after the way he had grabbed her hand that night on the porch, the way he had looked at her as if she belonged to him. It was during one of these nights, as Alicia sat in her room sketching aimlessly in her notebook, that she heard the faint creak of the floorboards outside her door. Her heart skipped a beat, and she froze, listening. There it was again, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, just outside her room. "Malcolm," she whispered, though she already knew the answer. Who else could it be? There was no response, just the sound of the floorboards creaking under his weight. He was standing right outside her door. Alicia's hands trembled as she put down her pencil. She stood up, tiptoeing to the door, and pressed her ear against it. For a long moment she heard nothing, just silence. Maybe he had gone away. But then, without warning, the doorknob turned. Alicia gasped, stepping back as the door rattled in its frame. She had locked it, thank God, but that didn't stop the panic from surging through her. She backed away until her legs hit the edge of the bed, her heart pounding in her chest. "Malcolm, stop!" she shouted, her voice cracking with fear. "Go away!" The rattling stopped. There was a long, tense silence, and then, finally, she heard his footsteps retreating down the hall. Alicia collapsed onto the bed, her entire body shaking. What had just happened? Was he trying to come in? What would he have done if she hadn't locked the door? The next morning, Alicia pretended nothing had happened. She couldn't face him, couldn't confront what had almost taken place the night before. Instead, she went about her day in a daze, avoiding Malcolm whenever possible. But she knew things were only getting worse. It wasn't long before their parents started noticing the tension between them. Karen mentioned it one evening while they were all sitting at the dinner table. "Is everything okay between you two?" she asked, her brow furrowed in concern. "You've been awfully quiet lately." Alicia forced a smile. "We're fine, Mom, just busy with school, I guess." Malcolm said nothing, keeping his eyes fixed on his plate. But Karen wasn't convinced. "Well, you know you can talk to us if something's wrong," she said gently. "We're family. We've always been able to talk to each other." Alicia nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "Yeah, Mom, I know." After dinner, she excused herself and went up to her room, desperate for some time alone. She needed to think, needed to figure out what to do. But as soon as she shut the door behind her, she felt the weight of everything crashing down on her. She sank to the floor, her back against the door, and pulled her knees to her chest. How had they gotten here? How had everything spiraled so far out of control? As she sat there, staring at the wall, Alicia knew she couldn't keep this secret much longer. Something had to give. Something had to break. But she had no idea that the worst was yet to come. The oppressive summer heat seemed to weigh heavier on Greenwood, as though the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to snap. For Alicia, the days passed in a fog of fear and confusion. She kept to herself, her interactions with Malcolm becoming brief and strained. There was an unspoken tension between them that seemed to hang in the air like a storm cloud, always threatening to burst but never quite doing so. Malcolm had changed. He was no longer the charming, easygoing brother she had grown up with. Instead, he had become withdrawn, his temper flaring at the slightest provocation. He spent more and more time alone, either brooding in his room or wandering around town late at night. His once promising future now seemed distant, as if the Malcolm everyone knew had slowly begun to disappear. Alicia could sense the darkness growing within him, but she didn't know how to stop it. She didn't know if she even could. At school, her friends tried to reach out to her, but Alicia pushed them away. She couldn't let anyone in, not when the weight of her secret was so crushing. Every time she saw Malcolm in the halls, her heart skipped a beat, and she quickly turned the other way. She couldn't face him. She couldn't deal with the intense look in his eyes, the way he always seemed to be watching her, even from a distance. But Malcolm wouldn't let her go so easily. One afternoon, as Alicia walked home from school, she felt a familiar presence behind her. She quickened her pace, hoping he would leave her alone, but she could hear his footsteps matching her own. She didn't have to turn around to know it was him. "Alicia," Malcolm's voice was low and sharp. "We need to talk." She ignored him, her heart racing. She couldn't do this, not again, not now. "Alicia, stop!" His voice had taken on a more threatening tone, and against her better judgment, Alicia froze. She turned to face him, her stomach twisting with fear. Malcolm stood a few feet away, his face dark with frustration. His eyes, once warm and familiar, were now cold and intense. "What do you want, Malcolm?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "You've been avoiding me," he said, taking a step closer. "I don't like it." "I'm not avoiding you," she lied, crossing her arms over her chest as if that would protect her. "I've just been busy." Malcolm narrowed his eyes, clearly not buying her excuse. "We're supposed to be in this together, Alicia. You can't just pretend it didn't happen." Her heart sank. She had hoped that ignoring him would make things easier, that maybe he would move on and let this nightmare end. But it was clear now that Malcolm had no intention of letting go. "I don't want to talk about it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just leave me alone." But Malcolm didn't leave. Instead, he moved even closer, his expression darkening with anger. "You can't run from me, Alicia. You're mine. You know that." The words sent a chill down her spine. She took a step back, her pulse quickening. "No, I'm not," she said, her voice shaking. "I'm not yours, Malcolm. We're not doing this." Malcolm's face twisted with frustration, and for a moment she thought he might lash out. But then he stepped back, his hands balled into fists at his sides. "You don't get it, do you?" he growled. "No one else will ever love you like I do. No one else will ever understand us. You belong with me." Alicia shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "You're wrong," she whispered. "This isn't love, Malcolm. It's something else, something wrong." But Malcolm didn't seem to hear her. His gaze had turned distant, as though he was lost in his own thoughts. "They'll never understand," he muttered to himself. "They'll try to take you away from me. But I won't let them." Fear gripped Alicia's heart. She had to get away from him, had to escape before things spiraled out of control. She turned and ran, her legs carrying her as fast as they could down the road. She didn't look back to see if Malcolm was following. She didn't want to know. When she finally reached the safety of her home, Alicia slammed the door shut behind her, leaning against it as she struggled to catch her breath. Her entire body was trembling, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. For a moment she thought she was safe, but deep down, she knew that the worst was yet to come. That evening, the tension in the Johnson household reached a boiling point. It started with something small. Karen had noticed Malcolm's growing distance and had confronted him about it during dinner. "You've been acting strange lately," she said, her voice filled with concern. "Is everything okay, Malcolm? You barely talk to us anymore." Malcolm didn't answer right away. He sat at the dinner table, staring down at his plate, his jaw clenched tight. Alicia sat across from him, barely touching her food, her stomach in knots. She could feel the storm brewing inside him, could feel the danger lurking just beneath the surface. "Malcolm?" Karen pressed, her brow furrowed. "We're worried about you." Malcolm's fork clattered against his plate as he abruptly stood up. "I'm fine," he muttered, his voice tight with anger. "I don't need you to worry about me." Karen blinked in surprise, clearly taken aback by his harsh tone. "We're your family," she said gently. "Of course we're worried. We just want to help." But Malcolm wasn't in the mood for help. He stormed out of the dining room, his footsteps heavy as he disappeared down the hallway. Karen and Marcus exchanged worried glances, but neither of them followed. Alicia remained frozen in her seat, her mind racing. She knew she couldn't stay here. She had to get away, had to find a way out before things got even worse. Later that night, as the house settled into uneasy silence, Alicia sat on her bed, staring out the window. The moon hung high in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard. Everything felt still, but she knew it wouldn't last. The door to her room creaked open, and Alicia's heart jumped into her throat. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. "Alicia," Malcolm's voice was low, almost pleading. "We need to talk." "No," she whispered, her voice shaking. "We don't." But Malcolm didn't listen. He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him, and for the first time, Alicia felt truly trapped. The air inside Alicia's room felt heavy, as if the walls were closing in on her. Malcolm stood in the doorway, his presence overwhelming, and Alicia could feel the weight of his gaze pressing down on her. She tried to steady her breathing, but her pulse raced uncontrollably. Every instinct in her body screamed for her to run, but there was nowhere to go, no escape from what was about to happen. "Alicia, we can't keep avoiding this," Malcolm said, his voice low but edged with a quiet intensity. He stepped further into the room, his broad shoulders casting a shadow across the dimly lit space. "You and we're the only ones who understand what this is. You know that." Alicia swallowed hard, forcing herself to look at him. "Malcolm, stop. This has to end," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "This isn't right. We can't." Malcolm's eyes flashed with frustration, and he took another step toward her. "I don't care what's right, Alicia," he snapped, his voice rising slightly. "I care about us. I care about you, and I'm not going to let anyone take you away from me." Alicia stood frozen, her back pressed against the wall. She had never seen Malcolm like this before, not this angry, not this desperate. His words were laced with a possessiveness that terrified her, and she could see now that he was beyond reason. "Malcolm, please," she begged, tears welling up in her eyes. "You're scaring me." For a moment, Malcolm's expression softened, and he looked at her with a mix of guilt and pain. "I don't want to scare you," he said quietly. "But I can't lose you, Alicia. You're all I have." Alicia shook her head, her voice breaking. "You don't have me, Malcolm. You never did." Those words seemed to snap something inside of him. Malcolm's face darkened and the tension in the room became suffocating. He stepped closer, his hand reaching out to grab her wrist, his grip tight and unyielding. "You don't mean that," he growled, his eyes burning with a dangerous intensity. "You're just confused. I know you feel the same way, Alicia. You have to." Alicia winced in pain, trying to pull her wrist free from his grasp. "Let go of me, Malcolm," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "You're hurting me." But Malcolm didn't let go. His grip tightened, and Alicia felt her panic rising. This wasn't her brother anymore. This was someone else, someone she didn't recognize. Just then, a voice echoed down the hallway, breaking through the tense silence. "Malcolm? Alicia? What's going on in there?" It was their father, Marcus. He had heard the commotion from downstairs and was now making his way toward Alicia's room. The sound of his approaching footsteps sent a wave of relief through Alicia, but it only seemed to heighten Malcolm's agitation. "Stay quiet," Malcolm hissed, his eyes wide with panic. "He can't find out. He can't know." Alicia's heart raced as Marcus's footsteps grew louder. She could feel Malcolm's grip tightening, his desperation palpable, but she couldn't stay silent any longer. She couldn't let this go on. "Dad!" Alicia shouted, her voice filled with fear. "Help!" The door swung open with a force that made both of them jump. Marcus stood in the doorway, his face a mask of confusion and concern. "What the hell is going on in here?" he demanded, his voice booming. Malcolm froze, his hand still wrapped around Alicia's wrist, but his eyes were locked on their father. The tension in the room was electric, and for a brief moment no one moved. Marcus's gaze shifted between his two children, trying to make sense of the scene before him. "Malcolm," he said slowly, his voice low and firm. "Let go of your sister. Now." Malcolm hesitated, his grip tightening for just a second longer before he finally released her. Alicia stumbled backward, clutching her wrist as tears streamed down her face. She had never been so relieved to see her father, but she knew this was far from over. Marcus stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he looked at his son. "What's going on here, Malcolm? Why is Alicia crying? Why are you in her room like this?" For a moment, Malcolm didn't respond. He stood there, his chest rising and falling with each heavy breath, his mind racing. But then something inside him seemed to snap. All the fear, the anger, the desperation, it all boiled over. "You don't understand, Dad," Malcolm spat, his voice shaking with emotion. "You don't know what's been going on. You don't know anything. Marcus's expression hardened. Then why don't you tell me? He demanded. Tell me what's going on. Malcolm shook his head. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. You wouldn't understand, he muttered, his voice bitter. No one would. But Marcus wasn't backing down. He took another step forward, his posture tense and ready. Try me, he growled. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're about to do something you'll regret. Malcolm's breathing grew ragged, his eyes wild with anger. I won't let you take her away from me, he snarled. I won't let anyone take her from me. The room seemed to close in on them as Malcolm's rage built to a breaking point. And then, in one horrifying moment, everything changed. Malcolm lunged at Marcus, his body fueled by desperation and fear. Marcus, caught off guard by the sudden attack, staggered backward, his hand reaching out to steady himself. But before he could react, Malcolm shoved him with all his strength, sending him crashing into the dresser behind him. A sickening thud echoed through the room as Marcus's head struck the corner of the dresser, and he crumpled to the floor, motionless. Alicia screamed. The sound seemed to snap Malcolm out of his fury, and he stared down at their father's lifeless body, his face pale with shock. Dad? He whispered, his voice barely audible. Dad, get up. But Marcus didn't move. Alicia rushed to her father's side, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch his shoulder. Dad, please, she sobbed. Please wake up. But there was no response. Marcus's body lay still, his eyes closed, and Alicia's heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. Malcolm stood frozen, his mind unable to process what had just happened. He looked down at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. I didn't mean to, he muttered, his voice distant. I didn't mean to. Alicia's sobs filled the room, and for a moment, everything was silent, except for the sound of her broken heart. But the silence couldn't last. We have to go, Malcolm said suddenly, his voice sharp and frantic. We have to leave now. Alicia looked up at him, her face streaked with tears. What? We can't just leave. We have to call someone. We have to... No, Malcolm interrupted, his voice firm. No one can know about this. We can't stay here, Alicia. We have to go. Now. Alicia's mind raced, torn between the overwhelming grief for her father and the fear of what would happen if they stayed. She didn't know what to do, didn't know how to make sense of the horror that had just unfolded. But deep down, she knew that Malcolm was right. If they stayed, everything would be over. With shaking hands, Alicia stood up, her legs weak beneath her. She looked down at her father's body one last time before turning to Malcolm, her voice barely above a whisper. Where will we go? Malcolm didn't answer. He didn't have to. All Alicia knew was that they were running from a nightmare that would never let them go. The night outside was eerily quiet as Alicia and Malcolm fled their home, the weight of their father's death pressing down on them like a heavy fog. Alicia's hands were shaking as they drove through the empty streets, the headlights cutting through the darkness. Her mind raced with thoughts she couldn't control. Memories of her father lying motionless on the floor, the sickening sound of his body hitting the dresser, and Malcolm's frantic eyes as he urged her to run. They had left everything behind. No one knew where they were, and for a brief moment, Alicia wondered if they could really escape. But the further they drove, the more she realized that no matter how far they ran, there would be no escaping the nightmare that had become their lives. What are we going to do? Alicia asked, her voice shaking. She kept her eyes on the road ahead, afraid to look at Malcolm. Malcolm sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, his jaw clenched. His hands were still trembling, and he hadn't spoken a word since they left the house. The silence between them was suffocating. I don't know, he finally muttered, his voice hollow. But we can't go back. Not now. Alicia's chest tightened as the reality of their situation sank in. They were fugitives now, on the run from the law, from their own guilt, from the lives they had once known. Everything had changed in an instant, and there was no going back. They drove for hours, through back roads and desolate highways, until the town of Greenwood was just a distant memory. But with each passing mile, Alicia's fear only grew. The weight of what they had done was crushing her, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the image of her father's lifeless body. We have to turn ourselves in. Alicia said suddenly, her voice trembling. "We can't keep running, Malcolm. It's wrong." Malcolm turned to her, his expression dark and unreadable. "We're not turning ourselves in," he said firmly. "If we do, it's over. We'll both go to prison. Is that what you want?" Tears welled up in Alicia's eyes. "But we killed him," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Dad is dead because of us." Malcolm's face hardened, and he looked away, his jaw clenched. "It was an accident," he muttered. "I didn't mean for it to happen." Alicia swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. "But it did happen, and now we're running like cowards." Malcolm slammed his fist against the dashboard, his anger boiling over. "We're not cowards, Alicia. We didn't have a choice." His outburst silenced her, and for a moment the only sound was the hum of the engine and the tires against the road. Alicia's heart raced, and she fought back tears, unsure of what to say. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that this was all just some horrible accident. But deep down, she knew the truth. They had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. As dawn began to break, they pulled into an old, abandoned farmhouse on the outskirts of a small town they didn't recognize. The house was a shell of its former self, with boarded-up windows and overgrown weeds crawling up the sides. It was the perfect place to hide, at least for a while. Malcolm led the way inside, kicking the door open with a force that made Alicia flinch. The house was dark and musty, filled with dust and the smell of decay. It had been abandoned for years, and Alicia shivered as they stepped inside, the weight of the past hanging heavy in the air. "We can stay here for a few days," Malcolm said, his voice quiet and distant. "At least until we figure out what to do next." Alicia didn't respond. She couldn't. Her mind was still reeling, and her body felt numb. She sank down onto the floor, her back against the wall, and pulled her knees to her chest, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. They were fugitives now, murderers. The thought made her sick to her stomach, and she fought the urge to break down in tears. She couldn't afford to fall apart, not now, not when everything was so fragile. But as the hours passed, the weight of their actions became unbearable. Detective Sheila Parker was a seasoned investigator, known for her sharp instincts and determination. She had grown up in Greenwood, knew the town inside and out, and when Marcus Johnson didn't show up for work the morning after his death, she immediately sensed that something was wrong. The Johnson family was well known in the community, and Marcus was a reliable man, never one to miss a day of work without notice. It wasn't long before Sheila began her investigation, retracing the Johnson steps and speaking to neighbors. The more she uncovered, the more her gut told her that something terrible had happened. When she learned that both Malcolm and Alicia were missing, her suspicions only grew stronger. With the help of local law enforcement, Sheila began tracking down leads, scouring security footage, and piecing together the siblings' movements. She knew it was only a matter of time before she found them, and when she did, there would be no escape. By the third day, Sheila had traced Malcolm and Alicia to the abandoned farmhouse. She approached cautiously, her instincts on high alert, knowing that the situation could turn dangerous at any moment. Inside the farmhouse, Malcolm paced back and forth, his nerves fraying with each passing minute. He knew they couldn't stay hidden forever, but he didn't know what else to do. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw their father's lifeless body, and the guilt gnawed at him like a cancer. "We can't stay here," Alicia said quietly, her voice breaking the tense silence. She hadn't moved from her spot on the floor, her eyes hollow and distant. "They'll find us." Malcolm stopped pacing and looked at her, his face pale and drawn. "I know," he muttered, "but where can we go?" Before Alicia could respond, they heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside. Their hearts pounded in unison as the door creaked open, and in walked Detective Sheila Parker, her badge gleaming in the dim light. "Malcolm, Alicia," she said calmly, her hand resting on the gun at her side. "It's over." Malcolm's body tensed, and for a moment it seemed as though he might run. But then his shoulders sagged, and he collapsed onto the floor, his hands trembling. There was no more fight left in him, no more denial. He knew it was over. Alicia remained silent, her eyes filled with tears as she looked at the detective. She didn't resist as Sheila moved toward them, handcuffs in hand. It was all too much, too overwhelming, and she no longer had the strength to fight. As the siblings were led out of the farmhouse, the weight of their actions pressed down on them like a crushing force. Their father was dead, and their lives were ruined. There would be no escape from the consequences of what they had done. Months later, during the trial, the courtroom was silent as the judge handed down the sentences. Malcolm was given 25 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 20, and Alicia received 15 years, with the possibility of parole after 10. Both were to undergo mandatory psychological treatment. The town of Greenwood was left stunned by the tragedy. The Johnson family, once a symbol of strength and unity, had been torn apart by a dark secret that no one could have predicted. The townspeople whispered about the family, their once proud reputation now marred by scandal and violence. As Malcolm and Alicia were taken away to serve their sentences, the weight of their guilt hung heavy over them. The bond that had once held them together had been shattered, and now they were left to face the consequences of their choices alone. In the end, there was no happy ending, no redemption, only the cold, hard truth that some actions could never be undone.